Hey, how's it going? It's James here. It's nearly 1 a.m. right now. So, what that means is that I am going to be retiring from this here room, which is downstairs. I'll call it my office, as I've finished with everything I've been doing in there. And I'll be taking my mug of water upstairs to this room here, which is currently my bedroom. And if I take you over to the far side of this room and show you what's actually in here, you can see that it is literally just a single mattress on the floor and then a few bits and bobs that are just scattered about. That is all my bedroom is at the moment. It's literally just a room with a bed. It lives up to the name of bedroom quite well. So, today, I have spent the majority of the day just tapping away on my practice pad. If you don't know what a practice pad is, it's basically like a fake drum that doesn't make nearly as much noise as a real drum, but it feels quite similar to tap away on it with some drumsticks. So it's basically a way to practice playing drums without making too much noise, because drums are very, very, very loud. And it's not always possible to be so loud without disturbing other people and receiving their complaints, which I totally understand. Even though I am a drummer, doesn't mean that I would want a drummer living next to me who plays all the time. Because I could see how, you do want peace in your own home, don't you? I know I do. So that's what I've been doing most of the day today. Is just tapping away on my practice pad, practicing, playing along with some songs, playing from a mix of songs on YouTube, and just sharing that practice process with all of the people who tuned in on TikTok Live. It's been a really good day. I'm making loads of progress with the TikTok, and I'm very happy about that. And I really just want to continue and just see more and more progress. When I say progress, I mean more likes, more viewers, more shares, more followers, more gifts, all that good stuff. I really want to focus on just putting the time and the hours into TikTok, going on lives. And now that I'm drumming on there, that seems to be boosting my following quite a lot, which is great. So anyway, I'm basically going to bed right now, and so I'll talk to you again in the morning. Good night. I've just got up. I've got a bit of a headache. Not feeling so good. Not feeling too bad. Not feeling too good. Had a text from Vodafone saying they had to restrict my calls, data, and texts because I haven't paid the bill. And I haven't paid the bill because I haven't been able to pay the bill. But I think either tomorrow or the day after, I should be getting paid. I don't know exactly, but hopefully then it should be getting switched back on. After I've got paid, after I've paid Vodafone. So I'm back to having no internet. I had no internet for a while recently because my mobile data just randomly stopped working. And then after speaking to Vodafone several times, they reset the network or something, and then it started working again. But I guess I can expect another day or two with no internet. I mean, at least a day or two. The reason I really wanted the internet is because I wanted to go on TikTok Live, but waking up this morning, my left wrist is so sore from being overworked because I've been drumming so much. And I haven't really practiced playing drums like to that degree for years. So I've effectively overdone it. and I can really feel it in my left wrist. My right wrist is okay, but my left one has a lot of catching up to do with the right one. The right one is much stronger, and the reason for that is basically when you're playing a hi-hat pattern, it's with your right hand, and it's a much quicker succession of notes. So if your right hand is going, your left hand is just going pat, pat, pat. So your left hand is just playing one stroke, pat, pat, whilst your right hand is playing 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. So that means for every 8 notes that your right hand plays, your left hand just plays 1. I mean, it's not always like that, but that's just an example of how your right hand, your right arm, hand, whatever, works more than your left one when you're playing drums, unless you're left-handed, or unless you play left-handed, or unless you play open-handed, or unless you just purposefully practice in a way that balances them out, which is something that I'm starting to do now. So I'm glad that I spent a lot of time yesterday and the day before playing drums on my practice pad on TikTok Live. It was great, but now that my wrist is sore, I think it needs a bit of time off before I can really start using it again. So that means having no internet is not such a big deal, but it is always an inconvenience because it's just useful to have internet readily available. Basically now I just have TV as, entertainment in the house, and books as well. So I'm reluctantly starting the day today at 2 p.m. Feeling somewhat depressed and having a bit of a headache. I'm going to take an antidepressant. Hopefully that will help. I'm also going to go make some coffee. That does usually help to start getting me stimulated, which is what I need when I realise that I'm not feeling so good, which happens quite often, more often than I would like, but it's okay. I've now stopped wishing that I didn't feel this way and just started figuring out, okay, well, I feel this way often enough. I've got to just figure out how to do something about it, take a proactive approach. So it's like knowing how to respond to how I feel when I feel that way. You know what I mean? Instead of thinking like I shouldn't feel this way. I don't think I shouldn't feel this way. I understand now that this is just how I feel regularly enough for it to be just pretty standard, So when I feel sick and depressed, now I just work through it however I can. Vlogging is actually a pretty great help. Social media is a pretty great help. Basically just have to start doing something, anything. And also, like, taking the right substances to affect the physiology, the chemistry, the biochemistry, the biology, whatever you want to call it. Basically just taking whatever needs to be taken to feel better. I have an antidepressant called sertraline that I take. And I also honestly just use coffee or caffeine as an antidepressant. I basically see sickness and depression as a symptom of being understimulated. And that basically just means I know now that I have to encourage myself to get into situations where there is some sort of sensory stimulus. And so I've basically reached a point now where it's like, if I'm depressed, anything that gives me anxiety is good, If I feel nervous or anxious, That's actually mental energy. That's like the overstimulation of mental energy. So that's actually what I need as a antidote to the depression, in the way that I see it. So for me personally, anxiety is not a bad thing. I think everything has got to be present in the right doses, and some degree of anxiety for me means being stimulated and therefore not feeling depressed. I sometimes hear about people talking about how they have anxiety and depression. I'm not sure personally how those two go together, because I can't make much sense out of that in the way that I think about it. But I basically end up thinking like everybody thinks about things slightly differently, and you simply just find the way that works for you, that makes sense to you personally. And it might not make sense to somebody else. It might, and I'm sure it will. I'm sure what I'm saying will make sense to someone, but it might not make sense to others, you know? I can definitely understand that there'll be people who feel like anxiety is not a good thing. But for me, at certain times, anxiety can be a good thing, and I try to give myself anxiety. Like for instance, how I know certain people who, if or when they drink caffeine, they say they end up with like this anxiety because of the caffeine. And that's what I'm talking about. That's exactly why I drink caffeine. That's why I've just made a coffee. I'm trying to give myself low level anxiety because it will be better than the alternative. For me, anxiety is like motivation. It's like, oh God, I feel overwhelmed. I feel overstimulated. Right, I need to go outside. I need to go for a walk. Like that. That's for me is good. That's how I get out of depression. Is by having that experience. You know, I have to have that experience to get out of the depression. You know, not wanting to go out or do anything. I need to find ways whilst I'm in the house to try to encourage myself to go and get on with life and live life and whatever, you know. It's just different ways of thinking about the same thing. Um, and the more ways you can think about it, maybe the more solutions you can find for different kinds of people who are in different kinds of patterns, who are thinking in different kinds of ways. Anyway, my finger is now healed up pretty much. I had a cut on it recently. So, I've been up for like an hour now. Just watched a bit of The Only Way is Essex. It's actually surprisingly good. The way that I just said actually obviously shows my negative expectations of the show going into it. But I actually quite enjoyed watching a little bit of that. I'm thinking about heading out for a bit now. It's been raining quite heavily earlier, but seems like it's stopped now pretty much. I don't know, there might be a few little droplets still. Anyway, I didn't go out at all yesterday, so I'm going to make sure I get out today. I just stayed in all day yesterday, practicing drums on TikTok Live. So for that reason, I'm going to get out today for at least an hour. I'm just going to take a walk into town, and no real plan apart from that. I came back from town quite a while ago. It's actually 8:30 p.m. now. Not been feeling so good for the last couple of hours. Still got a bit of a headache. But at the same time, I'm okay. I'm alright. I'm really contemplating what to do because I tried watching a bit of TV. Ended up turning it off quite quickly. That's about all I've really got to do now. It's like I've got just TV because there's no internet. Can't make any phone calls, can't send any texts. Or I can just go out and about again, walk. That might actually be the better idea. It's still light just about, as you can see from the window. It's going to be getting dark fairly soon. Just drinking some more coffee at 8:30 in the evening and just trying to make my mind up. Maybe I won't find anything good to do. Hmm. If I had the internet, I would most definitely get on TikTok Live, get the practice pad out, start tapping away. Even though my wrist is a bit sore, I would just power through. That's like my new favourite thing to do, is exactly that. So without being able to do that, I'm not really sure what I actually feel enthused about. I'm not really enthused about anything, to tell the truth. Just want to get my internet back. There's a chance the money will go into my account tomorrow. So as it's now 8:30 p.m., it might not be too long before I get back online and then I can use the internet again, get back on TikTok. It's really, really addictive, but I really don't want to stop. I really want to carry on. It's about the only thing I've really been getting any fulfillment from in the recent past. It really is good to be practicing drums again. If only on a practice pad for the moment, it's still great to be doing it again. It's a really good feeling. I missed it. I didn't even realize that I missed it because I just didn't even think about it. I think I really need to get that back into just part of my everyday, is that I practice drumming in some form or another. That did used to be a part of my everyday routine, and I don't really know when I stopped, but I don't want to stop again. I want to get back into that being my primary goal, you know? I remember when I felt really passionately about it, and the passion is starting to come back, and it's a great, great feeling. I'm really, really glad, you know? Anyway, my mind returns to the present, and the question is still the same. What shall I do? What shall I get on with now? That would be something I actually really want to do. Hmm. I don't want to ever have to wait for money. Possibly very, very soon, I may never have to wait for money ever again, which would be an incredibly good thing. What I could do is play music on my phone and then attach my phone to my Bluetooth speaker and then sit and tap away on the practice pad without being on TikTok. But it's being on the TikTok that is really the uh, the best bit, because there's always the sense of like, um, you know, anything could happen. Basically, if you go on TikTok Live, you start off with 0 viewers, and then viewers keep coming in, and then they keep going out all the time. So always this viewer count, or this number of viewers is always fluctuating. So it gives like a sense of excitement for like when there's not many people, you're waiting for more people. When there's a lot of people, you're kind of under pressure to perform for who's there, because you want to keep their attention. Because if you keep their attention, you can boost your likes, you can potentially get more follows, and you could get gifts, which basically translate over to real life cash that will actually go into your bank account. So sitting on TikTok Live is like you're always waiting for like, ooh, I could make some money, you know? And if you don't make money on a TikTok Live, then you probably could, then your goal is to get to get more followers, and with more followers, that means more people coming in and out and more potential of getting gifters, which means you could make money. I also like people coming in and asking questions and interacting, and I like the whole experience. And I love to play drums, but I almost don't see the point in playing drums for no one to even see it, or watch it or hear it, I just kind of think, what's the point? I've done that for years and years and years, decades even. So I only really play for the sake of other people's interest or attention or eyes and ears and all of that, because that's become much more interesting to me. That's become where the value is in doing it. So I could sit here and tap along to some songs, but I don't know if I'm going to do that. I really genuinely don't know what to do actually right now. I'm really not sure what I should do. I could do some more help just in general, like in life, more often, more consistently. Help from other people to just be talking to me, asking me questions, and just, I don't know, um, helping me out with, you know, finances or whatever it is that I want in order to be able to keep doing what I want to do. I think that's what I have to start to accept more now into my psyche, into my thinking, to be willing to accept and to request and to appreciate and to ask for help in its various forms. There's a book over there on my shelf that just caught my attention. It's called The Last Days of John Lennon. It's just there, that's it. It's got a bit of a reflection, so it's hard to see, but I just saw the look in John Lennon's eye when I was talking about needing help. I started thinking of the song Help by the Beatles. It's written by an author called James Patterson. It's got a very similar name to me, just with a P and a little bit of a difference. But I believe James Patterson has written many books, and he is an American author. I watched an interview with him not too long ago, and it was fairly interesting to listen to. Maybe I could read that book. I really don't know what to do right now. Like, the only thing that I want to do is go on TikTok Live, but I know that I can't. I guess I could possibly go on it if I connected to some Wi Fi somewhere, but I'd have to go out, find Wi Fi, connect to it, and then hope that it's speedy enough to process being on TikTok Live. But would I be able to tap along my practice pad to music out and about somewhere where the Wi Fi is? I don't know. Quite possibly not. But then I suppose I could do something else. Like, I could just talk to people, I don't know, sing, dance, tell jokes, just chat. I could do things like that. I do that kind of thing as well on TikTok. I don't just tap along on my practice pad to music. I basically do whatever I feel like doing on there. And I'm still really, really enjoying it. It was a bit jarring at first when I first realized, like, oh, there's this consistent sort of flow of like random people without, who don't have sort of profile pictures or TikTok or like any, that there's nothing that associates their account to them. So it's kind of like an anonymous account. Oh yeah, sorry, that's what I'm trying to say. There's a constant stream of people with anonymous accounts that come in and just like write abusive messages. But basically, it didn't take me that long to figure out like it's not really worth talking to them. Just click on it straight away, block their account, and then just carry on. And then that kind of solved that issue. At first it was kind of bothering me that these people kept coming in, but now it doesn't bother me at all because they're in an overwhelming minority, and the majority of people who come into my live streams on TikTok are really nice, pleasant, or positive, or whatever, or they're appreciative, understanding. I really do find as soon as I don't have internet, if it happens, I end up just sitting here in silence in the house. No TV on, nothing, just sat here. I know I wouldn't be doing that if I had internet. I can't really think of anything else that I want to do apart from literally just sit here in silence and just basically wait until my internet comes back on. Unless I can find something good on telly. Maybe I can. I don't know. Right now, I'd rather not even turn the thing on. I just don't want to hear any sounds. I don't mind the sound of my own voice, but don't really want to hear whatever's on the telly. It's just so hit and miss. It's such a gamble as to whether I'm going to find something like pleasant and enjoyable and interesting to watch, or whether it's just going to just I'm just going to be irritated and just annoyed by just the look of people's faces and the sounds of their voices and all of that. It's often like that for me. It's just like, oh, just why are you on my screen? Just please. Ugh. So a lot of the time I don't even bother turning the TV on for that reason. I know at least if I go on YouTube, then I can reliably go towards the channels of people that I've spent time watching, and I know for the most part that they can sort of bring content that is, to me, consistently good. TV is just not like that for me. I really don't know what to do for fun when I've got no money, no internet. I did end up watching TV just now. I just watched the 1% Club. It was alright, it was a decent watch, it wasn't bad. I'd just like to do something a little more interesting than that. Something where it's me being part of the world and making some kind of progress. Going on TikTok Live really feels like making progress and being part of the world. And you can go on there any time of day, any time of night, and you can be met by people all across the entire planet, which I find just amazing. It's so good. I really just want to go on it all the time now, and I just don't know what to do when I can't. I have to come up with some alternative thing to do if it's not possible to go on there. Making this vlog is one thing that I can do. I do enjoy talking to the vlog camera. It is different from talking to TikTok Live. I do like it though, in the same way. Doing this for, I don't know, however long it was. Like I did like 100 odd days in a row of vlogging every day, and I was filming a lot and talking to the camera a lot. It was doing that actually gave me the ability to be able to go on TikTok and to be able to do it, you know? I kind of realized eventually that was just kind of like practice for the live performance, the stage, you know? It's like making the vlog is like practicing drums in my bedroom where no one's watching or listening, and then TikTok Live is like being on stage doing a performance. So I guess if I can't be on stage doing the performance, I've got to go back to just practicing, which means talking to camera in the camera and doing the vlog. Which is fine. I'd just rather be doing the real thing. Like if I have the ability to now, I feel like I should just be on there all day, every day. For as long as I'm awake, I should be on there, because there's always potential to get more followers, and that means more followers means more money. And I really am addicted to it right now, and I just don't want to stop. Like it's all I'm thinking about. I just really, really want to just get back on it, you know? Watching TV just basically just feels like a waste of time when I know that it's possible, like what is possible, what the alternative is of what is possible, just makes watching TV just seem kind of pointless. Like irrelevant, There's nothing in it for me. I'm only doing it because I have no other choice, really. I mean, I do have another choice. I could go outside and go for a walk, or I don't even know what else I could do. I could try to find company, somebody to spend time with, somebody to talk to. I could try and make some money some other way, but it's probably not going to happen. It's probably not going to work. Not in the immediate short term. Whereas if you go onto TikTok Live, you can reliably make money in the short term just by going on there. If people come in and start gifting, then you can finish your live and have some money in your bank account. It's basically just like busking is now mainstreamed, and it's possible to do it from the privacy of your own home. And I was already doing busking before, but it's like now I can just busk on TikTok Live, and there's so many pros to it. There's very few cons. Like, you have way more control, but you still have an audience. You can still make reasonable money. It still gives you exposure, and building up a follower base is like really valuable, in the day and age that we live in now. And I've only just started to really realize that. A lot of the people that I knew realized that 10 years ago. I didn't really care about it or think about it or anything. And now I've started to see, like, this is the global currency now, is like social media following. Like, that's more valuable than anything almost. Now I've ended up watching Love Island. So this vlog is basically now just me talking about what TV programs I watch. Yay. This is no word of a lie. I've never, ever, ever watched an episode of Love Island ever. Until just now, this was the first one I've ever watched. I didn't really know what it was. I suppose I did kind of tell by the name, Love Island, and I heard it's a reality show and it's about people dating or whatever. I don't know. But yeah, I literally never watched a single episode of it ever until just then. It was okay. It's sort of interesting, like, from a psychological perspective, to sort of like watch what people do in their mating rituals and how they interact and everything. It's kind of interesting, actually. I used to love watching Big Brother when I was younger, and it's kind of like Big Brother but with more, romance. What I'm doing is basically just trying to distract myself from thinking about what I really want to do. What I really want to do being have some money and / or have internet access. That's what I really want to do. But until then, I'll just have to settle with watching a bit of television. Oh well. It could be worse, couldn't it? As long as I feel good, that's all that really matters to me. And I'll do anything I can to feel better than I do. And the best thing that I could possibly do is basically arrange and / or organize my life in a way such that I never really run out of money, which obviously isn't that what everybody wants, but I might actually be able to realistically make that possible very, very, very soon. So I'm going to try with everything I have to consistently and constantly, now, from now until who knows how long, at least the next year, or 1, 2, 3, 5, 10 years, I'm going to keep trying and trying and trying and trying to make sure that I am absolutely 100% financially very, very good, I think the issue that I have is that I really don't want to find a replacement for the internet. I just want the internet always to be there, accessible. I feel like it should be like that by now, but it's just the way that my payday lines up with my phone bill day. There's always a bit of a gap, and so I sometimes can't pay it, and then it ends up they cut off my service. It happens a lot. Life is going to be very, very good very, very soon, I believe. It may not be so good right now, but that does not mean that it cannot be very good very soon, because I do think it can. And I also actually realistically think it will. There's a number of reasons as to why that is what I think, what I feel, and I believe I have good reason to think that and to feel that. So, even if I'm not doing great right now, I am very, very optimistic that I will be doing great very, very soon. I do actually think it's not that easy to appreciate doing well and being happy and feeling good unless you don't feel that way. That's the only time when you sort of think, oh, wow, isn't it great when it's like that? It's great to feel great as well at the time, but it only really becomes something I become aware of when it changes and I'm not feeling so great. I do believe if there is a way to arrange your life to make everything work out good and well all the time, that is something that should be done. And there are definitely things that can be done to make life better. Making working a priority, putting time and effort and energy into the right things by discriminating in a positive way and figuring out what is a good, worthwhile effort that will be rewarding. Basically, like, yes, you have to work and you have to be ready to work, but you also have to work and be ready to work at the right thing. And picking the right thing is maybe more difficult than actually applying the effort. Applying the effort is not too hard, really. That's quite straightforward. There's things to think through with everything, but I also do sort of have the general belief that basically anyone can do anything if they really feel strongly attracted towards doing that thing, or you know, I I don't really agree with the idea that there's certain things for certain people and other people cannot do certain things, and unless there are reasons as to why that would be true, then just for the average person, I think the average person can adapt their abilities to do pretty much anything. It just requires having a willingness to take on the process of learning and then to actually apply the effort and put the time in. And that means basically having a natural enthusiasm. Now, it is a question of where does natural enthusiasm come from? That kind of, answers this whole idea that I'm coming out with right now. Can't believe I'm about to do this, but I'm going to make some more coffee at 10 p.m. That's right, the time is 10 p.m. and I'm making some coffee. I'm not thinking about whether I'm going to sleep or not. I'm just thinking about the fact that I feel depressed, and caffeine just helps, fingers crossed, to feel slightly less of that. Been watching Love Island. It's kind of interesting, like I was saying. It's a bit of a bizarre show. I'm basically just vlogging during every advert break. Instead of watching the adverts, just turning the volume down and then vlogging. All done in the effort to effectively defeat depression. Hopefully it works. I feel like it will. I already know the magic of the vlog and the power of the vlog, and it does help defeat depression. For sure, 100%. It absolutely does. It's worked for me many, many times. And I'm pretty certain now that it just works. I've not read any books for ages on the vlog. The book that I've been reading, not on the vlog recently, is by Gordon Ramsay. Only other book that I've still got left that I wanted to read is this one. It's that one I just showed you before. Last Days of John Lennon. I've got some other books laying around, like Flea, Acid for the Children. Might get around to reading some of that. Actually, in fact, I'm going to try a little bit of that book now. Actually, you know what? No, let's flip that out. Let's not do the Flea book. And let's go for the book that I've already started, which is the Jim Morrison book. I'm not very far into it, but Let's see, can't remember where I'm up to. Looking for lowlife, Jimmy started talking to the street people, and soon they found a quiet side street of gay bars. This was more like it, and they settled into a dark place called the Copper Skillet and ordered beers. Soon, Jimmy was talking to an attractive blonde girl with big tits and deep southern drawl, and she seemed to really like him. Then her lesbian girlfriend came up behind Jimmy and poked him in the chest with a stiletto. He was wearing a jacket, so there was only a puncture and a little blood, and they got out of there fast. West of New Orleans, hanging out at highway entrances with thumbs out, they were picked up by four people in a rusted Chevrolet and told to get in back. After a few miles, a one-eyed Cajun redneck riding shotgun turned around and announced that he'd just gotten out of prison. Brian almost soiled himself, but Jimmy, an experienced hitchhiker, just stared at the guy. Suddenly, he pointed a revolver at them. What we were in prison for was murder, he said, as his companions snickered. The driver produced a bottle of whiskey and ordered the boys to drink, but they refused. There was a silence for a while. Then the Cajun turned around again and cleared his throat. It was people like you that we could have murdered and gone to prison for. Silence. It was getting dark now, and Brian said that they wanted to get out. So the driver pulled off the road. Brian thought that they were done for, but they just told him to get the hell out of the car. Jimmy didn't say anything and just stuck out his thumb, trying to flag a ride. The next night in eastern Texas, they got a ride from a cousin of Vice President Lyndon Johnson, who insisted they spend the night at the LBJ Ranch in Johnson City. Johnson was in Washington at the time. At midnight the following day, they arrived in Juarez, Mexico, where Jimmy played out his B. Traven fantasies when their Fleabag Hotel turned out to double as a brothel. Jimmy Morrison, 19 years old, thought he'd captured the heart of the establishment's youngest and prettiest girl, an actual Mexican whore, just like in On the Road. But he was disappointed when she went off with a well-dressed hombre in his fancy car. Near Phoenix, an attractive middle-aged woman picked them up and invited them to her apartment. "There's some things I want you boys to do for me," she purred. Jimmy was game and told the woman they'd do anything she wanted, but Brian was scared and insisted they stay on the road and head west towards San Diego. Clara Morrison wouldn't let Jimmy in the house until he got his hair cut. She wasn't happy that he'd brought a friend and got mad when she found out they had hitchhiked across the country. After a few days at home antagonizing his mother, and with his father's ship delayed, Jimmy and Brian headed up to Los Angeles, where they stayed with Brian's cousins. Jimmy, it appeared to Brian, was in heaven. Jimmy loved the run-down business district of downtown LA, especially the Mexican neighborhood around Olivera Street near the Old Mission, and Pershing Square, where soapbox preachers tried to convert the winos and tramps who congregated there. When one of these orators took a break, Jimmy stole his stepladder, got up, and began preaching a hellfire sermon of his own until the indignant preacher pushed him off. Jimmy wasn't afraid of anything, Brian said many years later. I totally enjoyed his love of life and enthusiasm for every kind of bizarre situation that existed. Captain Morrison arrived home in June, and Brian took Jimmy down to San Diego to meet his ship, the aircraft carrier Bon Homme Richard. Jimmy and his father hadn't seen each other in 2 years, and Brian noticed they greeted each other with genuine affection. Jimmy spent a month with his family in Coronado, vainly trying to convince his parents to let him enroll in the UCLA film school. He begged them and presented several alternate plans, but Clara Morrison discouraged this idea. Jimmy was being educated for free in Florida, where his family officially resided, and she might not have wanted her younger son, now 14, to fall under the baleful influence of an impulsive hellion of an older brother. Finally, she shut Jimmy down completely with threats of loss of financial backing, and by June 18, 1963, the deadline to register for classes, Jimmy was back in Florida, unhappily resigned to returning to FSU's summer session in Tallahassee. Late that month, he hitchhiked to New York with a friend, staying at the Sloan House YMCA and visiting Greenwich Village and Carnegie Books on 57th Street. There, he caught up with the latest issues of Evergreen Review and Paul Krasner's satiric paper, The Realist, which featured obscene comics like the one Jimmy had drawn in high school. It was hot that summer in the metal camper,
but Jimmy kept his grades up. For a medieval European history class, he wrote a reportedly brilliant exegesis on Hieronymus Bosch, the mysterious Dutch painter of unspeakably detailed phantasmagorias, depicting late medieval life as a hellish maelstrom of human torment. Sparring verbally with the teachers dominating the classes he liked, he was respected and feared for his intellect and beatnik style. In September 1963, he began his fourth and last trimester at FSU by moving his books to the seedy Cherokee Motel, a former rendezvous for out-of-town state legislators and the local hookers. Jimmy was comfortable in room 206, liked the decent bed and the maid service, and the Cherokee became the template for the long series of inexpensive motels that he called home for the rest of his days. With Mary Werbelow at his side and consequently on his best behaviour, to the undying relief of the apprehensive groom, Jimmy attended Brian's wedding that September. Then he moved his library and himself into an apartment with a small group of older art students and instructors he'd been hanging out with. He told an interviewer later that some opium had found its way to this apartment, his first taste of narcotics, and he puked his guts out after getting high. Mary came up for the weekends when she could. The couple attended a big costume party at FSU that autumn, with Jimmy memorably dressed in a harlequin clown suit complete with stockings, belled cap and pointed slippers. He made a point to talk to nobody at the party but Mary. Later that month, on their way to an FSU football game on September 29, 1963, Jimmy and his friends were carousing in Tallahassee. Some cop cars pulled up and Jimmy stole an umbrella from a police cruiser. They arrested him, charged him with larceny. A cop's helmet had also vanished in the melee, being drunk and disorderly and resisting arrest. At the station, the cops pushed and slapped him when he compulsively mouthed off, tore the buttons off his shirt, photographed him looking like the bleary, dishevelled 19-year-old punk that he was. The next day, knowing he was in trouble, Jimmy asked for help from the professor for whom he'd written the brilliant Bosch paper. The teacher got him cleaned up and vouched for him in court, and Jimmy was let off with a $50 fine. The university, mindful of his good grades, only put him on disciplinary probation. In October, without telling his mother, Jimmy applied to transfer to the Film Studies program at the University of California at Los Angeles. He was accepted later that fall and even assigned advanced placement in the term beginning in January 1964. That autumn, Jimmy landed the role of Gus in a student production of The Dumb Waiter, Harold Pinter's two-character play about a pair of hitmen waiting to murder someone. It was his first public performance since his ukulele jams at the Contemporary 2 years earlier. Jim quickly turned the rehearsals into anarchic, absurdist experiments in obscene improv, prompted in part by his reading of Theatre of Cruelty Mage Antonin Artaud. In the mimeographed program, Jimmy was billed as Stanislas Boleslavsky, which conflated the names of Konstantin Stanislavski, the Russian actor who created method acting, and Richard Boleslavsky, who had worked in the Moscow Art Theatre with Stanislavski before arriving in America to make films. Waiting for the curtain to rise, the other student actor, Keith Carlson, never knew what Jimmy was going to do. He played scenes and read lines differently every night, sometimes improvising bits of stage business, refusing to repeat himself. The director, who had given Artaud's essays to Jimmy, was kept in a state of suspense. They were all afraid some of the lewd rehearsal material might slip out in live performance. There was a constant feeling of apprehension, Carlson recalled, anticipating the atmosphere at later door shows, and a feeling that things were on the brink of loss of control. With Jim, we just never knew. A performance photograph of Jimmy wearing his hair long, with mutton chop sideburns and being berated by Carlson's character, was published in the school paper. Uncharacteristically, he clipped the picture and sent it to his mother. President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas on Friday, November 22nd. Jimmy watched the news programming at the FSU Student Center as numb as everyone else. 2 days later, he watched as the accused assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald, was murdered on TV by the owner of a Dallas strip joint. In a notebook, Jimmy noted that Oswald had tried to escape arrest by ducking into a movie theatre, which may have appealed to Jimmy's interior linkage between film and morbidity. From then on, Kennedy's death occupied a dark corner of the Morrison psyche, making frequent appearances in notebooks and later lyrics. Dead President's Corpse in the Driver's Car is one of the keystone images from both Celebration of the Lizard and the song excerpted from this long poem, Not to Touch the Earth. Jim Morrison was 20 years old on December 8, 1963. Less than a month later, Capitol Records, the Beach Boys label, would begin to promote the impending arrival of a new band from England called the Beatles. Radio stations began playing the first Beatles records, Love Me Do and I Saw Her Standing There. As if responding to an occult summons to cheer up depressed America, the Beatles duly arrived in New York early in 1964 with their 90-second love songs, Long Hair, Sharp Suits, Chelsea Boots, and Bluff Repartee to shake American youth out of its post-assassination despondency. After the youthful Jack Kennedy's brains were blown out in public, American kids were ready for anything, and they took to the Beatles like dogs on a meat wagon. The Beatles were soon followed by the Rolling Stones and the other British invasion bands, all of whom, like Jimmy Morrison, looked west to Los Angeles as the new mecca of rock and roll. In December, Jimmy left Tallahassee, having told only a few friends and teachers that he wasn't coming back. Jimmy and Mary had a vague plan that she would come to Los Angeles when she graduated from high school in June. They would find an apartment and live together. Jimmy left his books with his grandparents and flew to California, spending Christmas with his family in Coronado. He wouldn't return to Florida for another 5 years, and when he finally came back, it was only to commit professional suicide. The Doors of Perception. On the same notebook page on which Jimmy recorded the Kennedy assassination, he wrote the name Aldous Huxley. This was because Huxley, one of the preeminent British authors of the century, died at his home in Los Angeles on the same day Jack Kennedy was murdered. But unlike the dead president, Aldous Huxley left his life under the influence of a massive dose of LSD-25. By the time Jimmy arrived in Los Angeles 6 weeks later, he was thoroughly immersed in Huxley's visionary quest for a shortcut to enlightenment, and its natural starting point in Southern California. It was no accident that the name of the band Jimmy would start 18 months later was taken from the legendary book Huxley wrote that alerted the Western world to the new frontiers in the expansion of human consciousness. After achieving worldwide success with his utopian novel Brave New World, Aldous Huxley emigrated to the US and settled in California in the late 1940s. Los Angeles was then a place of endless orange groves, immense ranch lands, and producing oil wells, with a resident film colony in Hollywood and a tiny but determined intellectual and artistic community. I nearly said autistic community then. Huxley, like many of his fellow British expatriates, was able to see the spiritual and even utopian possibilities of the semi-arid landscape. Its mild year-round climate and fertile valleys guarded by majestic mountain ranges provided a dramatic landscape for the restless dreamers who flocked to the southwest shore of the North American continent, the last possible stop on the European migration to the New World. The American movie industry had relocated to Los Angeles from New York in the 1920s, which in turn drew a mass migration of the best-looking people in the country as they tried to pursue their Hollywood-inspired versions of the American dream. After World War II, the top echelons of the entertainment industry, movies, television, and popular music became concentrated in Los Angeles. The 1955 opening of the Disneyland amusement park on an old citrus farm in Orange County was the final consolidation of California and this was heavily promoted by Disney on television, the land of make-believe. Huxley wrote that Los Angeles was like Venice during the Renaissance, an independent city-state that had funneled the riches and wisdom of Asia to Europe. In 1953, Huxley and his friend Humphrey Osmond, a British research psychiatrist, began taking mescaline. They were following in the footsteps of the psychologist Havelock Ellis, who in 1898 described the ritual use of mescal or peyote by the Indians of the American Southwest. Mescal, a mild hallucinogen taken from certain cactus plants, led to mescaline, a synthetic version of the chemical agent present in peyote. Huxley and Osmond experienced supercharged visual phenomena, peculiar time expansions, and heightened streams of consciousness under mescaline, which led Osmond to coin the word psychedelic to describe the effect of hallucinogens on the brain. In 1954, Huxley published an account of his experiments, The Doors of Perception, the first book by an author of Huxley's stature to explore previously unmapped areas of human consciousness. Huxley took the title of his epochal book from the English visionary poet William Blake. If the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is, infinite. Beat writers had already begun experiments with the psychedelic drugs. Poet Gary Snyder had taken peyote while studying Amerindian culture at Reed College in 1948. Allen Ginsberg had tried it in New York in 1959, followed by Kerouac in Big Sur the following year. In 1960, Timothy Leary, a psychologist working at Harvard University, returned from a summer vacation in Mexico with so-called magic mushrooms containing the psychotropic agent psilocybin, which he gave to Ginsberg, Kerouac, and Neil Cassady, who had been the model for Dean Moriarty On the Road. In 1964, the year that Jimmy arrived in Los Angeles, Tim Leary published his first book, The Psychedelic Experience. The book's subtitle, a manual based on the Tibetan Book of the Dead, pointed to the quasi-religious caste that psychedelic drugs were already acquiring, especially in San Francisco, where still legal LSD-25 was beginning to be sold on the street. In that year, Leary assumed the mantle of LSD's prophet. Don't trust anyone over 30 became his war cry, followed by the hypnotic mantra, turn on, tune in, drop out. Leary later explained, turn on meant activating your neural and genetic equipment. Tune in meant interacting harmoniously with the world around you. Drop out meant a voluntary detachment from involuntary commitments like school, the military, and corporate employment. But dropping out was not yet an option for Jimmy Morrison. With the military draft still hanging over every straight, able-bodied American male, Jimmy knew that the only way to avoid compulsory service was to stay in school. This point was strongly underlined by Jimmy's visit to his father's ship when it docked in Long Beach in January 1968. Captain Steve Morrison now had the command of the USS Bonhomme Richard, one of the Navy's premier aircraft carriers. When Jim had first arrived at his mother's house after leaving Florida, she insisted he get a haircut. When his father's ship docked after a tour of the Western Pacific, Jim went aboard in a conservative Ivy League outfit of khaki trousers, a button-down dress shirt, and a cardigan sweater with leather patches at the elbows. Captain Morrison took one look at his truculent, slouching son, aspiring beat poet, nouvelle vague film buff, slacker, collegiate draft dodger, and ordered him to the ship's barber for another more military trim. As a Navy photographer documented the visit, Captain Morrison ordered his carrier out to sea. Jimmy observed the ship's Marines conduct a live fire exercise and reluctantly joined in, firing at floating targets with an M16 rifle. Alright, I enjoyed reading that, so I'm going to read a bit more. The Blue Bus. Jimmy Morrison arrived at UCLA in mid-January 1964, enrolling in the Theatre Arts Department as an advanced placement film major beginning the second half of his junior year. Whether or not his parents paid his UCLA tuition is unknown. One source indicates that his grandparents helped him financially. Another suggests that he was able to draw on a college fund established by his father when he was born. Jimmy found a small apartment on Goshen Avenue near UCLA in Westwood, then still a quiet university village, where he fell into the routines of a bohemian student on the fringes of campus life. To support his book buying habit, he got a part time job at Powell Library, the red brick neo Moorish colossus across the grassy quad from Royce Hall, UCLA's performance auditorium. Classmates from that time remember him as a pudgy, dishevelled kid in beat up tennis shoes, pushing a cart full of books to be shelved in the library stacks. UCLA classes changed to the hourly bells in Powell's Tower. The bells gave Jimmy Morrison, as he confided to a notebook, the first degree of contentment he had felt in years. He was finally back in California, the only place in which Jimmy felt he really belonged. One night, feeling good, he did his human fly act for some new friends and climbed into the bell tower and threw his clothes to the ground as the chimes struck midnight. Film studies was a new academic field in 1964, and film student was considered synonymous with goofball, slacker, draft dodger. UCLA's program was housed in several rusting Quonset huts left over from World War II. Across town, the University of Southern California's film school was in an old stable, but where USC's film school was oriented toward getting local kids technical jobs in the Hollywood movie industry, UCLA's more boho students were interested in current film theory, auteurism, French New Wave cinema, avant-garde movies, and underground and experimental films. At USC, the film students read Variety. At UCLA, they read Cahiers du Cinéma and Film Culture, published by Jonas Mekas' Anthology Film Archives in New York. When UCLA film students prayed, they faced towards the Cinématique Française in Paris. UCLA Film School heroes included French New Wavers Jean-Luc Godard and Francois Truffaut, Norman Mailer and John Cassavetes, who were making starkly literary films away from the Hollywood tradition. Andy Warhol and his transformation of pop art ideas into non-narrative films such as Empire, a single 8-hour shot of the Empire State Building in Manhattan, and Stan Brakhage, who treated film stock itself as an artist's canvas, sometimes scratching or painting his negatives to produce abstract, expressionist imagery on the screen. The teachers were an interesting mix of semi-retired Hollywood directors like Stanley Kramer and at least one old-school European director. Jimmy was disappointed that John Renoir, author of Rules of the Game, had just left UCLA, but the arrival of the legendary Joseph von Sternberg more than made up for Renoir's absence. Jimmy was able to watch von Sternberg's classic films, The Blue Angel, The Devil is a Woman, along with running commentary in the director's theatrical German accent. Jim would later say that von Sternberg's last film, Anatahan, had the most profound effect on him. Both Jimmy and his UCLA classmate Ray Manzarek studied with von Sternberg, and Manzarek makes a crucial point when he refers to the German expressionist roots of the Doors. Jimmy, he says, studied the unsmiling, smouldering body language of Marlene Dietrich, von Sternberg's greatest star, and would adapt it when posing in his leathers in the early days of the Doors. UCLA's faculty and students were proud to follow a generally hipper aesthetic than that of Hollywood, which was still selling in the 1950s Rat Pack culture of booze and broads, and indeed would never really get the American 60s at all. It is somewhat ironic that the only classmate of Jimmy's at UCLA who would achieve fame as an author, a director, authorially, I don't know how to pronounce that, responsible for the entire film was Francis Ford Coppola. Jimmy loved the cultural mix at UCLA, applied himself and got good grades. He told friends he loved film school because the history of film was only about 70 years old. Anybody can be an expert, he said. I love that most about movies. In his spare time, he caught the blue bus that took UCLA students out to the beach and the bright lights of Santa Monica Pier. He always had his nose in a book, John Rechy's harrowing gay hustler saga City of Night, or Dave Wallace's post-apocalypse novel Only Lovers Left Alive. Saxophonist Stan Getz's ultra-sophisticated The Girl from Ipanema was a big hit on the radio, an early taste of the Brazilian bossa nova beat that would begin the Doors' first record. Another side of Bob Dylan hinted at the post-beat folk poet's imminent conversion to electric band music. The Beatles were on the rampage with I Want to Hold Your Hand, and girls were starting to scream at rock and rollers again. Jimmy watched the Beatles' epic first appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show in February 1964 along with the rest of America. The motion picture division of the theatre arts department was small, with only a few dozen students, but Jimmy soon made himself the centre of a group of existential misfits like himself. Their main hangout was the Lucky U, a Mexican restaurant just off campus that featured a cook named Pancho, working in an open kitchen and a big combo plate that chunky, overweight Jimmy liked to wash down with a couple of cold Tecate beers. Many of Jim's UCLA friends remained near him for the rest of his life. There was Dennis Jacob, known as the Weasel, for his furtive look and scurrying walk. He was as well read as Jimmy and could argue the fine points of Nietzsche far into the night. Movie buff John DeBella was the burly son of a New York cop who bragged that he'd stolen more books than Dennis had read. Phil Oleno was an obsessive Orson Welles fan who still lived in his Attorney father's comfortable home, something that Jimmy teased him about. Paul Ferrara was a cinematographer who knew his way around a 16mm Bolex camera. Alain Ronay had instant cred for being French and for having once met Henry Langlois, founder of the Cinémathèque Française. Frank Lisiandro was an aspiring film editor with a good critical eye and an instant admiration for Jimmy Morrison's weird and addictive charisma. And then there was Ray Manzarek. Ray was older than most of the others, being technically a graduate student. Born in 1939, he had been raised in a big Polish-American family in Chicago, where he studied classical piano and listened to blues DJs Al Benson and Big Bill Hill, playing the work of the masters Muddy Waters, Howlin' Wolf, B.B. King and Little Walter on the radio. He had graduated from DePaul University as an economics major, served 2 years in the Army, and followed his family to California, when they relocated to Manhattan Beach, south of LA. In 1963, Ray enrolled at UCLA's law school, but dropped out after 2 weeks, transferring to the film school instead. Ray was something of a star at UCLA because he had an exotically stunning Japanese-American girlfriend, Dorothy Fujikawa, and a working bar band, Rick and the Ravens, with his 2 brothers. Ray was also cool because he booked the faculty and won. As an ardent fan of European directors like Ingmar Bergman and Michelangelo Antonioni, Ray's student film that spring featured a chaste montage of the luscious Fujikawa taking a shower, an innocuous sequence that was still deemed too suggestive by one of the professors who stupidly ordered it cut from the version to be shown at the semi-prestigious Royce Hall screenings of the best work produced by the film students that year. Ray refused to cut the shower scene, faced down the committee convened to look into the situation, and won the right to show his film uncensored. Everyone at the school was impressed. John DeBella introduced Ray to Jimmy, who would appear in the party sequence of Ray's 1964 student film Induction, more than a year before they started The Doors. During the Easter break in 1964, Jimmy and 2 friends spent a few debauched days along the notorious Avenida de la Revolucion in Tijuana. Jimmy enjoyed chatting up the streetwalkers, getting stone drunk on tequila and beer, and running from the packs of roaming dogs when the bars closed at dawn. Felix Venable was another older graduate student who had a lasting influence on Jimmy. Felix was already 35, a graduate of Berkeley and a familiar early 60s archetype, the professional student and beatnik. He was slight and bony, with thinning blonde hair and a sharp nose jutting out of a haggard face. He was also brilliant and extremely fucked up. Ray Manzarek, who also knew Felix, described him as a plain evil-minded fuck. Felix lived in a squalid bungalow along the polluted canals in rundown Venice Beach, where he gobbled speed pills, drank wine, and turned hungry, vulnerable Jimmy Morrison, who couldn't legally buy beer, into an alcoholic. Everyone at UCLA thought Felix was an asshole. Jimmy Morrison thought he was cool and adopted him as a mentor because Felix had some beat wisdom to impart. Felix had followed the disaffected North Beach beatniks who left town when San Francisco became commercialized and relocated to funky rundown Venice Beach. Felix knew many of the poets and mesmerized Jimmy with beat legends like poet Gregory Corso's exploit of sneaking into Dylan Thomas's hospital room at midnight and watching him dying in an alcohol coma until the night nurse found him and threw him out. Soon after Jimmy began hanging out with Felix, he began muttering Dylan Thomas quotes. Whatever is hidden should be made naked. To be stripped of darkness is to be clean. Or, my poetry is, or should be, useful to me for one reason. It is the record of my individual struggle from darkness toward some measure of light. Felix might have given Jimmy LSD for the first time, and it is known that the two of them began tripping during weekend excursions to the haunted deserts southeast of Los Angeles. They would drive out to Joshua Tree in the high desert or to Santa Ana Canyon, where the Indians thought the devil had lived. On one trip to the hidden canyons around Palm Springs, 3 hours east of LA, Jimmy had a spectacular shaman-like experience that flashed him back to the Indian car wreck he had witnessed as a child. Felix might have been the first person Jimmy told about his notion that the souls of one or more Indians entered his child's fragile eggshell mind as he watched their owners dying on the road. Back on Goshen Avenue, Jimmy immersed himself in shaman lore as if he intended to use it to construct a future persona. In tribal cultures, shamans meditate between the tribe and the spirit world, curing the sick and maintaining the equilibrium between the clans. Shamanism had fascinated Western philosophy and psychology since Russian missionaries had first identified Siberian practitioners in the 1700s, and the opening of the American frontier brought the tribal medicine man into American popular culture. In the 60s, with the immense resurgence of interest in spiritual pursuits, shamans and their rituals were seen as glamorous and far-out survivals of the religious practices of pre-antiquity. By 1964, Timothy Leary was already comparing the psychedelic experience to the shaman's intoxicated journey to the gods and back. There is speculation that Felix told Jimmy about a former UCLA anthropology student he knew, a serious guy who had done extensive field work in the Sonora Desert of Mexico with a Yaqui Indian brujo or shaman. Jimmy knew someone in the department and apparently made contact with Carlos Castaneda, whose dissertation would become the 1968 bestseller and counterculture Bible, The Teachings of Don Juan, a Yaqui Way of Knowledge. Poet Michael Ford was also at UCLA at the time and believes Morisson did meet with Castaneda, but no details of the meeting survive. Castaneda, contacted by a researcher 15 years later, had no memory of meeting Morisson. However, in the summer of 1964, Jimmy began including the Indian shaman riff in his psychic curriculum vitae for anyone who would listen. Secret alphabets. The summer of 1964 was Freedom Summer in the American South. College students were being murdered by the Ku Klux Klan while registering black voters in Mississippi. But at UCLA, with its tiny minority of black students, Jimmy Morrison was known for getting crazy drunk and shouting the N-word around campus just to provoke the well-intentioned. As a conservative Southerner, Jimmy seemed to have a racist fear of black people that unfortunately surfaced when alcohol impaired his ability to control himself. That summer, the Beach Boys' Fun 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 and I Get Around were big jams on the radio, along with the Rolling Stones' sinister blues traveling Tell Me. In Southern California, the sporty new Ford Mustangs, red Honda motorbikes and Vespa scooters were cool rides, but Jimmy Morrison was always seen on foot, walking along in his languid southern shamble between his pad and his library job, unless he could convince a girlfriend to drive him. Living with his mother, brother and sister in Coronado that summer, He started a new notebook, possibly in July, and wrote the words Notes on Vision on the cover. Later published as part of his first book, the jottings and Apercus in this and other spiral-bound notebooks began as an explicit homage to his recent reading of Illuminations, the legendary collection of symbolist prose poems by the French enfant terrible Arthur Rimbaud. Rimbaud was a perfect lost poet exemplar for Jim Morrison, as he was for the Beats. The entire romantic agony of the 19th century was summed up in this teenage genius, an instinctive, offhand amateur poet who stopped writing at age 19. In fact, it's impossible to overestimate the influence Arthur Rimbaud had on Jim Morrison. Many luminous images from Illuminations, The Universal Mind, The Feast of Friends, The Face in the Mirror, turn up later in Doors lyrics written by Jim, and he obviously patterned the poetic musings of the Lords and the New Creatures after Rimbaud's surreal epigrams. Most important of all was Jimmy's uncritical adoption of Rimbaud's famous poetic manifesto, dashed off in a letter to a friend in 1871. The first study for a man who wants to be a poet is the knowledge of his entire self. He searches his soul, he inspects it, he tests it, he learns it. As soon as he knows it, he cultivates it, but the soul has to be made monstrous. Imagine a man planting and cultivating warts on his face. One must, I say, be a visionary, make oneself a visionary. The poet makes himself a visionary through a prodigious and rational disordering of all the senses. Every form of love, of suffering, of madness, he searches himself. He consumes all the poisons in him, keeping only their quintessences. He arrives at the unknown, and even if, half crazed at the end, he loses the understanding of his visions, he has seen them. Let him be destroyed in his leap by those unnameable, unutterable, and innumerable things. There will come other horrible workers. They will begin at the horizons where he has succumbed. Reading these lines in the introduction to the New Directions edition of Illuminations that he owned and underlined, Jimmy undertook, consciously or not, to follow Rimbaud's Promethean pronouncement that the true poet was truly the thief of fire. He accepted Rimbaud's challenge and prodigiously and rationally disordered his senses every day for the rest of his life. The initial literary results were highly charged and sometimes breathtaking. The Notes on Vision journals brim with a film student's hothouse insights on the nature of seeing, the powers of the eye, the properties of the camera, the new alchemy of cinema, the secrets of the serial voyeur, the sniper's eye, the horror of television and its hold over the world, seances, dead presidents, sleep, prisons, the shaman, mothers and incest. Many pages recycled film lore and legend, much of it reportedly learned from John DeBella. Jimmy worked on these notebooks almost every day while he was at UCLA, and some of the raw material percolated into the papers on film aesthetics he wrote during his final year at school. Later in the summer, he went back to Mexico with his brother Andy and an older family friend who was a retired Navy officer. In seedy Ensenada, Jimmy initiated his brother into the world of women and drink, hauling him from bar to bar, talking to all the girls in the street. Lions in the street and roaming dogs in heat, he went down south and crossed the border, left the chaos and disorder. Back at home, Jim would get drunk and act up at the Navy base's movie theatre, mocking military decorum. In August, his mother gladly let him return to UCLA early to get ready for school. He went back to his $1.25 an hour library job, but got fired by a new supervisor when he couldn't show up on time. In August 1964, the USS Bonhomme Richard, Captain Morisson commanding, was on station in the South China Sea, part of a carrier fleet that included the USS Ticonderoga and the USS Constellation. After some secret and provocative attacks on North Vietnamese positions by American Special Forces, the captains of two American destroyers claimed they were attacked by North Vietnamese patrol boats in the Gulf of Tonkin. President Lyndon Johnson ordered retaliatory bombing raids launched from the carrier's decks. A few days later, on August 7, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which gave Johnson's government blanket authority to assist the South Vietnamese in their war with the Communist North. Though it was hard to envision at the time, many congressmen and senators later claimed they had been deceived. The United States was about to begin 10 years of warfare that would tear the nation apart and result in millions of deaths, ultimate defeat, and national humiliation. And one of the most murderous ironies of the whole era would be that while Jim Morrison was becoming rock music's anti-war spokesman, make a grave for the unknown soldier, his father was fighting a futile war against communism on the other side of the world. In October 1964, the student revolt of the 60s began at Berkeley. UCLA was an apolitical party in campus, but UC Berkeley was hot with attitude. A minor spat over censorship in the student commons escalated into civil rights style sit-ins and demonstrations that spread to other campuses around America. Mario Savio, the charismatic student leader of the free speech movement, became the first non-showbiz spokesman for the post-war generation that California beamed out to America, presaging the political turmoil that would prevail at some American universities within 4 years. The Santa Ana winds start blowing across Southern California every year as summer turns into fall. Unlike the Pacific winds that usually wash California with ocean air, the Santa Ana winds come from the east out of the desert, blowing the Southern California smog back in the faces of the polluters. Santa Ana winds are associated with bad news and bummers. Fire season in the dry hills, earthquakes, street crime, car crashes, drownings, overdose, chronic headaches, and general malaise. The Indians believed the winds came from Santa Ana Canyon, which Jimmy and Felix Venable visited along with Scorpion Woman Peak and other weird sights around LA that autumn. For the next 7 years, the Santa Ana winds seemed to have an unsettling effect on Jimmy as they accompanied a series of yearly crises that happened to him every autumn. According to Navy records, Captain Morrison's ship returned to California in November 1964, but Jimmy decided to spend Christmas with Jeff Morehouse's family in Los Altos, along with some other young guys from scattered Navy families who had grown up together. Daily, Jimmy distinguished himself by drinking a big glass of gin for breakfast without appearing to be affected. Jeff's mother, who had known Jimmy as a child, scolded him about this, but Jimmy just laughed his high, whinnying chortle and poured himself another. He left a few days later, and Jeff Morehouse never saw him again. Jimmy Morrison had turned 21 on December 8, 1964. It is unsure whether he had any contact with his parents during the holidays, although one source says that he saw his family after Christmas and may have flown to Florida with them to see his grandparents and Mary Werbelow. What is known for certain is that after December 1964, Jim Morrison never saw his parents again. Okay, Chapter 3, Live at the Whiskey. 1965 was year zero for rock music. It was the pivot of the decade, the real beginning of the 60s, when post-war baby boom culture took over the Western romantic tradition and turned the volume way up. In England, the Beatles and the Rolling Stones tuned pop music into the new drug culture. In America, Bob Dylan's heroic songs, such as Like a Rolling Stone, opened the post-existentialist era with their lyrical innovations and chains of flashing imagery. Later in the year, Dylan helped invent the rock movement by playing an electric guitar at a folk festival, turning the vulgar instrument into a political statement and making obsolete the old explanations and mildewed rationalities, as the beat poet Michael McClure put it. In 1965, all the elements that made the decade were in place. The Americans began bombing North Vietnam in March, to national and worldwide outrage, engendering the political climate that gradually poisoned the nation. The pacifist civil rights movement was being transformed by its younger activists into a violent struggle for black power. Birth control pills paved the way for the sexual revolution, so-called free love and abortion on demand. Marijuana and psychedelic drugs were subverting mainstream America from underground. Eastern religions, the Dharma moving west, were seeping in via California and London. Assassinations, riot, and rebellion were in the air. The literary novel was behind the curve, and the movies were hopelessly lost, out like the fat kid at dodgeball. Music, fashion, and pop art carried the swing in that crucial year, which Jim Morrison later described as a great visitation of energy. Much of the new pop energy was English or came from the East Coast, but in Southern California, a handful of young musicians was about to create the new hybrid of quality aesthetics and hype called folk rock. Jim Morrison and the Doors would later rise to fame on the backwash of this unstoppable wave. This genesis of the scene, the new Sunset Strip culture, uncannily coincided with Jimmy Morrison's arrival in Los Angeles. In January 1964, a couple of guys from Chicago opened a nightclub on Sunset Boulevard called the Whiskey A Go Go. The Whiskey was a huge departure for LA nightlife. Old Hollywood and Rat Pack nightclubs like El Mocambo and Chiro's had mostly peaked by the late 1950s when Frank Sinatra's crew moved their acts to Las Vegas's gambling hotels. In 1963, a club operator and jazz fan named Elmer Valentine, who'd been a cop in Chicago, visited Paris to get inspiration for a new kind of club he wanted to open in Los Angeles. Exploring Paris's jazzy left bank club scene, Valentine found the Whiskey A Go Go, Castle, and other new discotheques in full swing, drawing an older jet-set crowd who liked to dance to Motown and the Beatles and French pop records that were supposed to be for teenagers. Valentine brought this concept, adults dancing to pop songs, back to California, and with some partners opened the Whiskey A Go Go in an old Bank of America branch on the corner of Sunset and Clark. The Whiskey was a new sensation from the moment it opened. The headliner was a young Louisiana rocker called Johnny Rivers, whom Valentine had stolen from Gazzari's, a rival club. Between sets, the audience could dance to 45 RPM singles spun by a girl DJ working above the crowd in a glass-walled cage, an innovation inspired by the old bank's weird space limitations. The first DJ hired for the club didn't show up opening night, so the cigarette girl got the job. Patty Brockhurst was wearing a fringe slit skirt, and when she started to dance along to Smokey Robinson, the Shirelles' It's My Party, I Want to Hold Your Hand, He's a Rebel, Downtown, Wooly Bully, What Did I Say? The crowd went nuts. Thus was born that icon of the mid-60s, the Go-Go Girl. Valentine immediately hired two more dancers. One of them, Joni Labine, designed the official Go-Go Girl uniform, fringed mini dress, lots of hair, no bra, and short, white, high-heel patent leather boots. The discotheque was a new concept in America in 1964, and the club immediately filled with the Sebring-styled younger brothers of the Rat Pack-era swingers and their beehive-coiffed girlfriends. When the Whiskey took off, Sunset Boulevard started to happen again. Veteran scene makers like record exec Lou Adler and Sonny Bono, who plugged records for Phil Spector, saw adults in coats and ties dancing to rock and roll and realised the audience was broadening. Pop music was thought unsuitable to nightclubs that depended on liquor tabs for profits, but then Johnny Rivers hit records, covers of Chuck Berry's Memphis and Maybelline, and the album, Live, made him a viable attraction for the town's swinging young moderns. The Whiskey drew turnaway mobs from opening night. The novelty of rock and roll on the strip, plus the sexy lure of the writhing go-go girls, attracted movie stars and media attention. A local beat artist named Vito Polekas, who lived with his premature hippie tribe in a redwood hut in Laurel Canyon, started bringing gangs of extremely attractive and scantily clad kids to dance at the Whiskey. Vito's dancers had a new kind of dance whose swinging hips and sinuously seductive arm movements also almost mocked the nervous tension of New York dances like the jerk. One of Vito's troupe was Rory Flynn, daughter of Errol Flynn. When Rory danced at the Whiskey in her sheer negligee, the men stopped breathing and the world turned all around her. Hollywood jammed into the Whiskey to get a look. Steve McQueen, the reigning action movie king of Hollywood, installed himself as a regular in his own booth. Natalie Wood, Warren Beatty, Julie Christie, Life magazine ran a spread. Jack Parr broadcast The Tonight Show from the club. Cary Grant was photographed dancing there. When the Beatles hit LA, John Lennon and Paul McCartney were chauffeured to the Whiskey by Valentine himself, who brought along Whiskey regular Jane Mansfield for the ride. John started putting her on. Come off it, love. They're not real, are they? Until Jane let them see them naked. Elmer Valentine, gruff and lovable, became a local celeb. Jack Nicholson famously quipped that he looked like all seven of the dwarves. Now new clubs sprouted like mushrooms in the enchanted forest. Cairo's changed from a restaurant lounge to a rock and roll club. The the Action, The Galaxy, Brave New World, Fred C. Dobbs, Bedo Litos, The Sea Witch, and Pandora's Box all began showcasing rock acts by 1965 when Elmer Valentine opened his second club, The Trip. Television jumped on the energy with pop shows like ABC's Shindig and NBC's Hullabaloo, both featuring go-go dancers who became national stars overnight. On the weekend nights, younger kids started pouring onto Sunset Boulevard from the San Fernando Valley and the upscale suburbs, hanging out 10 deep on the sidewalk and spilling into the Strip, stalling traffic, annoying the cops assigned to move the immense crowds along, creating a frisson of tension and malaise in the usually balmy night air lit by the headlights of purring muscle cars, GTOs and Stingrays, and garish neon from the clubs. There were so many kids you could hardly move from one club to another. The scene on the Strip was sensational, highly sexualized, vividly exhibitionistic, and magnified by television. It set the tone for the rest of the country. Now the clubs needed young musicians to play in them. So the somewhat corny plastic glamour of Sunset Strip reached out to the Los Angeles folk scene for the raw talent that would propel it worldwide. There was plenty of new blood working in the folk clubs, and they began following Bob Dylan into Electric Ladyland. The folk revival of the late 1950s in Boston and New York that had made millionaires of California's Kingston Trio and spawned dozens of folk groups and jug bands was petering out in the wake of younger stars like Joan Baez and Dylan. Greenwich Village folkies Jim McGuinn, the Limelighters, and John Phillips, the Mugwumps, migrated to Los Angeles where they mingled with local stars at the Troubadour on Santa Monica Boulevard and the Ash Grove on 3rd Street, Ben Frank's on Sunset, and the Golden Vanity, which was out in the valley. There were dozens of coffee houses where any ballsy genius could get up and play, including rockabilly painters like Captain Beefheart and teenage slide guitar prodigies like Ry Cooder. This circuit now began to throw up new bands. Jim McGuinn met David Crosby and Gene Clark, who formed the Jet Set and began to grow their hair like the Beatles and Stones. The Jet Set changed their name to the Byrds and started playing weekends at Cairo's, the frayed lounge on Sunset. The Byrds had once played a rent party for Vito Polekas when he was in a jam, and now he brought his retinue of Laurel Canyon lovelies over to Cairo's and immediately moved the hip scene away from the suddenly passé whiskey. Those famously luminous nights, the Byrds at Cairo's brought hip Los Angeles out on the Strip and set them dancing in the streets, dancing on the cars, wild and freeform with flailing arms, buckskin fringe and long hair, all airborne on Jim McGuinn's 12-string guitar and Missourian Gene Clark's great songs. The Byrds legend was underway. The hot underground flash on both coasts. They got a demo tape to Miles Davis's agent, who got it to Columbia Records in New York. Columbia's new A&R guy, Billy James, had worked with Bob Dylan in New York and interested Dylan in McGuinn's idea of putting some of Dylan's new song to an electric backup. This became folk rock, blending the tense energy of rock and roll with the social conscience of folk. The Byrds released their version of Bob Dylan's Mr. Tambourine Man in May 1965, and it was an immediate smash, reaching number one on the national charts. The whole Sunset Strip scene just exploded when the Byrds got on the radio. It was like the Strip changed overnight in May 1965. You couldn't drive west on Sunset anymore because it was too crowded, with barefoot kids blowing bubbles and rattling tambourines. Mr. Tambourine Man would have been number one forever if the Rolling Stones hadn't released Satisfaction a month later. Nazis on TV. Jimmy Morrison began his last semester at UCLA in January 1965. Mary Werbelow arrived in Los Angeles around that time, but she didn't move in with him, preferring to get her own place. She took classes at LA City College and soon got a job as a go-go dancer at Gazzari's on the Strip. This annoyed Jimmy, who, like most cool student bohemians, thought the action on Sunset Strip was for teeny boppers and squares. But Mary Werbelow had what it took: big breasts, dark red hair, and according to Ray Manzarek, who knew her, she knew how to shake that thing. By the end of the year, she was billed as Miss Gazaris of 1965, much to Jimmy's disgust. His innocent Florida high school sweetheart had been absorbed into the tawdry sleaze of Sunset Strip. They drifted apart. You can't make this stuff up. At school, Jimmy acted like a frustrated artist, thwarted in his dreams. He wanted to make a film about Nietzsche's descent into drooling insanity after seeing a horse beaten in the streets of Turin, but couldn't get it together. His friend Phil O'Leno had made a diagnostic training film for the psychology department consisting of a young couple stripping to their underwear and caressing chastely. Jimmy rescued Phil's unused footage and made his own film. He cut this footage real fast, O'Leno recalled, so it looked like there was a lot more going on, a lot more. But that would be like him, to make a controversy out of something that he could use. He was a mischievous person. It caused quite a furore at the showing. Everyone was screaming at him, especially all the faculty. In his notebooks, Jimmy wrote concentrated poems that described a superhuman elite of elevated beings, the Lords, who operated on a higher psychic plane than the rest of humanity, who saw things as they were. The Lords invisibly imposed a version of social control that seemed derived from William S. Burroughs' Nova Mob. These pages also contained caricatures of dozens of fellow students like Alan Ronay, Phil O'Leno, and Dennis Jacob, catching their physical quirks with a few deft lines, or Ray Manzarek in a jacket and tie, a goofy smile and a quiff of hair, an arm possessively draped around his ever-present girlfriend, Dorothy Fujikawa, identified by straight black hair, slanting eyes, and a sexy skirt. Jimmy carried a copy of Rimbaud's Illuminations wherever he went and appeared in several student films in his pose as the human fly, walking the parapets of tall campus buildings, reading Rimbaud's Apercus aloud like a West Coast version of Truffaut's film hero Antoine Donnell. Jimmy had never been any good with his hands and had little patience for the mechanics of 16mm film production, so the technical aspects of things like film splicing eluded him, with the result that his edits and Godard-inspired jump cuts tended to disintegrate in the projector when he tried to show them. Once he got so frustrated in the cinematography lab that he started throwing cans of film and kicking the furniture. No one knew what it was about, but it made a lot of noise. Jimmy also drank a lot of wine and had a rep as a roller of perfectly formed, cigarette-like joints. He preferred coarse yellow wheat straw rolling papers or zigzag number 225 rice paper with two leaves glued together. No one understood why Jimmy couldn't splice film, but still somehow managed to craft such perfectly tubular reefers. As the winter rains subsided and the weather grew warm, he hung out with the other film school slackers by the Gypsy Wagon lunch cart near the school, or at the Lucky You Mexican restaurant. Jimmy wrote smutty graffiti on the walls of the toilets. He had these deep-set eyes and would just stand around, doing his Marlon Brando thing, brooding. He was the class method actor. He was also overweight and cultivated a stoned look a lot of the time. But classmates acknowledged that Morisson was unusually dedicated to learning the obscure byways of film history. Ray Manzarek recalls that Jimmy once hitchhiked 450 miles all night to Berkeley for a one-time only screening of French existentialist hero Jean Genet's ultra-rare homoerotic prison movie Un Chant d'Amour. Only the hippest, most hardcore cinema freaks in LA took the trouble to make the scene. Jim was a very talented and brilliant person, Phil O'Leno said, but he was a little too young to be wise. In his notebook, Jimmy wrote, "Cure blindness with a whore's spittle." In March 1965, the American government began bombing in Vietnam. The military draft was in full swing, sending thousands of Jimmy's generation into the nightmare of Asian jungle combat against a determined peasant guerrilla army. Jimmy spent the spring of 1965 working on his student film, a combination senior thesis and final exam that could make or break his quest for a UCLA degree in cinematography. Mary Werbelow refused to appear in it because 1. Her new agent told her not to, 2. The sequence called for a girl wearing only lingerie, 3. She had shown up at Jimmy's place and caught him with another girl. They had begun making out to the bombastic strains of Carl Orff's Carmina Burana, a Morisson fave playing on Jimmy's little hi-fi, so a disturbed and angry Jimmy used his cameraman and featured player John DeBella's beautiful blonde German girlfriend Elke instead. There was no script. We're just going to wing it, Jimmy told DeBella. The untitled original film, essentially just a work print with a soundtrack, was first screened at a grading session and kept breaking in the projector, which reportedly embarrassed Colin Young, the film division chairman. It was shown again at the senior screenings held in May 1965 in one of the film school's squalid Quonset huts. Since Jimmy Morrison had a love him or hate him reputation, the room was packed with students who sat through 40 films by wannabe Truffauts, Chris Markers, and Andy Warhols. Jimmy's film was one of the last shown. About 50 people saw the film, and all would have varying memories of what they saw. When the film starts, Jim later said, the screen is black and you hear noises, a mixture of a record called Erotica and a tape of a priest and some children chanting something back and forth from a Catholic catechism hour on the radio. It sounded like something primitive out of the jungle. DeBella says there was a fuzzy test pattern film from the Outer Limits sci-fi TV show. Then cut to a group of young men, the film crew, smoking and getting ready to screen a presumably pornographic stag film. The film breaks and the men fill the white screen with crude hand shadow puppets. Then they throw darts at the Playboy centerfolds taped to the walls of Jimmy's apartment on Goshen. Over insistent Navajo peyote chanting, a woman is seen from behind walking down the street and disappearing into an elevator. This sequence was shot on LA's downtown Skid Row. Jimmy is seen taking a cheek-sucking draw on a marijuana joint. As his eyes bulge, he cuts to stock footage of an atomic bomb going off. Then he delivers a huge wink to the camera. Others recall that this scene started the film. Cut to a black and white wooden console TV with a big blonde Elka sitting on top of it in a bra, panties, garter belt and black stockings, like a parody of the Blue Angel as the shot pans slowly down. Then she straddles the set, so the following images seem to come from between her legs. Ray Manzarek, who was there, says Jimmy could be heard shouting over the Stones song that was playing, turn the TV on, turn it on. DeBella's hand reaches in and switches the TV on, then changes the channel to, fortuitously, Victory at Sea images of marching Nazi stormtroopers taking a salute from Adolf Hitler under flying swastikas. Leave it on, Jimmy yells, it's perfect. And so on. Porn, drugs, television, Nazis, sex, music, irony. The film broke once, then again, to murderous groans from Jimmy's fellow students. Somehow the film got threaded through the projector. There was no plot, no beginning, no middle, no end. The girl licks DeBella's eyeball to purge the filmmaker's eye of the toxic imagery of the TV. Then the TV is turned off and the film ends in a white video line that ends in a black dot. There was a horrid silence when Jim Morrison's student film was over. The vibe was suddenly chaotic in the steamy screening room, blue with tobacco smoke. No one got it except a few of his friends, and they loved it. Everyone else hated it and said so. Jimmy was perceived by many at UCLA as a hostile guy, talented but altogether probably disturbed, who liked to provoke and put people on, then put them down. Now some of that negativity bounced back at him hard in public. Several faculty members announced that it was the worst student film they'd ever seen. The women hated the pictures of naked girls. His advisor, Ed Brokaw, told Jimmy he was disappointed in him. One professor, deeply offended by the Nazi bit, attacked Jim personally, calling him and his film degenerate. An hour later, Jimmy was seen in a phone booth, reportedly tearful, as he told his troubles to someone unknown. He got a D grade for his work. He told Ed Brokaw and Colin Young that he was quitting the program, but Young talked him out of it. Jim just put a lot of things he liked into his film. Ray Manzarek would tell I Magazine 3 years later. It didn't have anything to do with anything. Everybody at UCLA hated it, but it was really quite good. A vocal minority defended Jimmy's film as astute non-linear cinema. Largely nerds, they all loved seeing Elka in her bra and panties. I'd say it was less a film than an essay on film, Morrison said later dryly. In any case, Jim Morrison graduated from UCLA in June 1965 with a BS degree in cinematography. Still bitter, he skipped the graduation exercises and hung out on the beach in Venice instead. His diploma was mailed to Clara Morrison in Coronado. Jim Morrison's legendary, technically incompetent post-beat student film, deemed too awful to have a negative cut for the Royce Hall screenings of the year's best, went into the trash with the other subpar wastes of good celluloid, and so is lost to posterity. Live at the Turkey Joint West. By May 1965, there were seismic shifts in the music world as LA folk rock suddenly took over AM radio. Sonny Bono and his girlfriend Sherilyn Sarkisian, who were singing backup vocals for Sonny's boss Phil Spector, broke out as Sonny and Cher after massive TV exposure with I Got You Babe. Former New Christie minstrel Barry Maguire hit #1 with the nuclear fear anthem Eve of Destruction. Neil Young and Stephen Stills formed Buffalo Springfield in the wake of the Byrds. Arthur Lee, the first black mod in America and the brilliant prototype for Jimi Hendrix and Sly Stone, formed Love, the first interracial band on the Strip. John and Michelle Phillips were newly arrived in LA with songs like California Dreamin' and Monday, Monday in their heads, songs that would consolidate LA's claim to be the new generator of American pop. The Rolling Stones were also in town. Phil Spector convinced England's newest delinquent aristocracy that they should be making their dark pop art records in LA, an idea validated by 1964 rock masterpieces like The Last Time and It's All Over Now. The Stones were cutting at RCA Studios, arguing over their new song Satisfaction. Keith Richards hated it but got outvoted by the rest of the band. It came out in June 1965, a fuzz-toned complaint about girls, soap powder and cigarettes that knocked the California bands off #1 for the rest of the summer. Jimmy Morrison developed something of a fixation around this time for angel-headed hipster Brian Jones, who had founded the Stones 3 years earlier. Jimmy Morrison was an ardent fan, as surviving notebooks reveal. They contain numerous references to seeing Jones on television, especially the 1965 Shindig broadcast where Brian told the show's host to shut up so that Howlin' Wolf, the hellacious Chicago blues star who was the Stones' special guest, could make his network television debut. With his golden bowl of blonde hair reflecting the hot lights of mid-60s black and white TV, Brian Jones gave off a semi-divine cathode ray aura on television, a shocking and visceral blast of Dionysian energy. Brian Jones's blunt aggression and watchful charisma made a deep impression on America as he shared the front line of the Stones with Mick Jagger. In LA, Brian was the most visible of the Stones, while Mick and Keith sat knee to knee at the Hollywood Ambassador Hotel writing their next album, Aftermath. Brian Jones got dressed up and made sensational visitations onto the Strip, where he was mobbed on the sidewalks and in the shops and clubs, a numinous exemplar of English pop and swinging London's saucy glamour. And it wasn't just the street teenies or the Mexican whores he hired who dug him. When not in the studio, Brian was courted by the local post-beat hepcats. Dennis Hopper, the young actor and pop art collector, followed Brian around with his camera. So did motorcycle riding artist Wallace Berman, who took Brian out to his house in Topanga Canyon for a photo session. Intelligent, well-spoken and affable when he wanted to be liked, the notoriously difficult Jones was on his best behaviour and obviously dazzled by Hollywood and its azure swimming pools, fin-tailed Cadillacs and mansions up in the hills above the Strip. Brian moved around LA like a young god by night, in a pill and booze haze that could turn weird when he got really loaded. Jimmy knew some of the girls who staggered out of Brian's pink poolside bungalow at dawn, carrying lurid tales of sadism, beatings, orgies, and general rough treatment by that insatiable maniac who played guitar for the Rolling Stones. It's possible that Jimmy Morrison had some kind of encounter with Brian Jones in this period. 4 years later, in 1969, one of Jim's major poetic works would be dedicated to Brian, illuminated by detail that could come through personal experience. There is also a May 1965 fan snapshot of Brian taken at the instrument store, Wallach's Music City, where the Stones got some of their gear, including the Gibson fuzzbox used on Satisfaction. Brian is in a mod collar and a seersucker jacket, surrounded by admiring fans, one of whom looks very much like Jimmy Morrison. Brian Jones was notorious for whispering to people, which drew them closer into his orbit and got them to pay attention to what he was saying. Starting that summer, people around Jimmy got annoyed because he started to whisper all the time like Brian Jones. There's no doubt that Ray Manzarek discovered Jim Morrison. Ray originally knew Jimmy through DeBella and Oleno and was checking him out as some kind of potential collaborator as early as the winter of 1965. Ray was a semi-pro musician making 30 bucks a week in Rick and the Ravens, the South Bay surf band started by his younger brothers, Rick and Jim Manzarek. The Ravens wore electric blue jackets, ruffled white shirts, desert boots, and blasted out Dick Dale instrumentals and Louie Louie and Hoochie Coochie Man at frat parties, and every couple of weeks at a bar called the Turkey Joint West at 2nd Street and Broadway in Santa Monica. All the Manzarek brothers had seriously musical training, so they were more than competent. Ray had a strong left arm from hours of practicing stride piano and a relaxed facility on his electric keyboard that allowed him to spice up the solos he took on rock numbers with quotes from Debussy, J.S. Bach, Bill Evans, and Bud Powell. Rick and the Ravens even had an indie record deal and had released a couple of nowhere singles on World Pacific's Aura sublabel. They almost got on Shindig, but the invitation fell through. Introduced as Screamin' Ray Daniels, the bearded blues shouter, Ray Daniel Manzarek sported a beatnik goatee, mixing beat-back partitas with Otis Spann piano licks. The eldest of the brothers did a Chicago R&B feature in the middle of the surf show that stretched out into a jazz approximation of what the extremely hip Paul Butterfield Blues Band was doing in Chicago, mixing urban R&B with modal sounds from the mysterious East. The Ravens were fun but mediocre. With no original songs and a charisma challenge lineup, it was a band going nowhere, and Ray was broke. Ray was an earnest pothead, but he wore straight-looking jackets and a tie, making him seem older and decidedly Ivy League. He was also ambitious and wanted into the musical energy exploding in Los Angeles. He was also a spiritual seeker who was an early student at Maharishi's Mahesh Yogi's 3rd Street Meditation Center. He was a jazz fan who dug John Coltrane and Thelonious Monk and the MJQ and Brazilian bossa nova, and knew you could combine that sophistication with rock and roll the way the folk people had done. Ray saw something totally rock and roll in Jimmy's loutish rebel attitude, and for reasons unknown to his brothers kept trying to bring Jimmy Morrison into the Ravens' orbit. But Jimmy had no recognisable musical ability whatsoever. No one had heard him sing yet. He'd forgotten his piano lessons. He was useless on any instrument and had a shaky sense of rhythm. He was also withdrawn and pathologically shy in his non-manic moments. He just looked like a rock and roll star to Ray, who would drop in at Jim's place with Dorothy. It was a nice apartment near the VA hospital at Wilshire and San Vicente, with a wall filled with books and Playboy pin-ups and pictures of the London model Jean Shrimpton. Another wall displayed an enormous pop art collage that Jim was working on, composed of hundreds of images clipped from magazines. Jean Shrimpton and Brian Jones were repeatedly featured in this work in progress. Since Jimmy was mysterious about his family, people at UCLA were curious about where he came from and his background. Dorothy Fujikawa thought Jimmy's family must have some money because of the expensive electric blanket she noticed on his bed. Ray kept visualizing something, intuiting a latent potential in Jimmy that was waiting for something to happen. Once, when the Ravens were hired to back up Sonny and Cher at a high school dance and one of the guitar players couldn't make it, Ray paid Jimmy $25 to just stand there holding an electric guitar. Jimmy strummed an unplugged Fender Strat and glowered and moved around in his feral, faintly unpleasant way. Then, at the end of May, Ray invited a whole bunch of UCLA classmates to a party at the Ravens gig at Turkey Joint West, and at the midnight hour, when everyone was lubricated, Ray announced, "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a special treat tonight. Here he is, direct from the UCLA Film Department, Jim Morrison." Jimmy had never sung on stage before that anyone knew. Ray says that he looked around with his goofy smile. People were clapping. Jimmy did this laugh he had, he he he, and then he jumped on the little stage. Rick Manzarek started playing the Louie Louie intro. Suddenly, completely unexpectedly, Jimmy Morrison let out this ungodly, hog-calling rebel yell that landed on the dance floor like a grenade. The place exploded as the drummer rocked the beat, and the girls in their shifts and sandals started to shake like pagans. Jimmy and Ray sang it together. Louie, Louie, oh baby, we gotta go. People talked about that night for years. Jimmy loved it and thanked Ray later. He also told Ray he was heading for New York. This gave Ray a sinking feeling. Jimmy told friends that he was going to New York to see about hooking up with underground filmmaker Jonas Mekas and trying to make poetic alternative films like that one about Nietzsche and the horse. Okay, I met the spirit of music. That's the name of the next chapter. But then Jimmy changed his mind. When Phil O'Leno and John DeBella invited him on their post-graduation trip to Mexico, Jimmy told Phil he was staying around. No, Jimmy said, I think LA looks pretty good to me right now. There's energy happening here, I'm not going anywhere. His family seems to have cut off whatever financing he was getting, so Jimmy moved out of his apartment. He would never again have a home of his own. He crashed on classmates' couches for a while. He threw away his shoes and went barefoot all the time. Jimmy's UCLA classmate, Dennis Jacob, was the resident janitor of a seedy old apartment house on Speedway Avenue, a block away from the Venice Beach boardwalk. In early June 1965, Jimmy moved his books into the basement storage area and began sleeping on the building's roof. He used Dennis's bathroom and kept clean by swimming in the ocean. A girlfriend named Carol Winter also let him stay with her in nearby Ocean Park when it rained. She also fed him now and then and let him roll his perfect doobies from her stash of Panama Red. But mostly, Jim had just stopped eating. Instead, he began taking daily doses of LSD, using the still legal hallucinogen to raise his consciousness and blot out the psychic trauma of his past. With no money or income, he began fasting and losing weight. He stopped cutting his hair completely. He stopped speaking. He worked feverishly on his notebooks. He spent hours on the roof of the squat grey building where in better days the old movie comedian W.C. Fields had once lived, and stared out at the palm trees, the sandy beach, and the Pacific horizon framed between two taller buildings. He saw few people, and to those who knew him, it seemed like he was using his languid Venice days to change himself from a college student dependent on his family to a neo-beat poet of a type that was completely familiar to Venice's older denizens. The town of Venice had been laid out as a fashionable resort by developer Abbott Kinney in the southern Santa Monica wetlands just before World War I. Kinney built streets and sold house lots along the canals that he dug. He built the Venice Amusement Pier and on it the Venice Pier Opera House, where in the early 1920s Kid Ory's band played the first New Orleans jazz concert in California. Eventually, Kinney overextended himself and went broke trying to recreate an Adriatic port in Southern California. Soon, oil derricks polluted the canals and Venice became LA's Japantown and a hotbed of illegal gambling. By the 1940s, Venice was full of bingo parlours, elderly pensioners and clip joints catering to the World War II sailors who flocked to the boardwalk's carny attractions when their ships were in. 10 years later, Venice was faded and run down. 4-room bungalows housed 3 Mexican families with their kids and chickens. Then old-school beatniks fleeing San Francisco began to settle into Venice's bohemian grove. Former storefronts became painters' studios, unused lofts turned into beat pads. When Allen Ginsberg was in town, he read his poetry accompanied by bongo drums at the Gaslight Club. On weekends, Venice still drew crowds of freaks and tourists along its carny beachfront, but the rest of the time it was a quietly civilized and inexpensive neighborhood where college students, artists, and Mexicans coexisted in peace and tranquility. Alright, we're going to take a little pause there.